Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. Another year has gone by. We've decked the shelves with boughs of holly, and it's time to look back over our favourites from 2023. As ever, we've sorted them into handy categories: Best New Release, Best Backlist Gem, Best Nonfiction, Best Book Club Book, and our favourite comfort read before we get to our overall book of 2023. We'll even mention a few books that let us down, but 'tis not the season to dwell. Instead, this episode is a celebration of everything we love about books and reading. Dialing in from New York is our dear friend and regular podcast, Phil Chafee. As usual, Laura's coming to us from Vancouver, and I'm here in London. And so, let's get to those book stacks. 2023, the year that Prophet Song by Paul Lynch won the Booker Prize here in the UK, Blackouts by Justin Torres won the National Book Award in America, Shankari Chandran's Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens won the Miles Franklin in Australia, Jon Fosse won the Nobel Prize, yet another feather in UK publisher Fitzcarraldo's extremely feathery cap. It was the year that books written by robots started to feel like a disturbing possibility. Cormac McCarthy died, and Martin Amis. Also, Friends star Matthew Perry, whose memoir Friends, Lovers and the Big Terrible Thing continues to appear on bestseller lists. 2023 was the year of the celebrity memoir. Britney Spears finally got to tell her side of the story with The Woman in Me, while Prince Harry's memoir Spare turned out to be a surprisingly good read, thanks to ghostwriter J.R. Moehringer. As the challenges we face in the world increase, one thing that is a constant is the plentiful number of good books to read. So many that you may find it difficult to narrow them down. We're going to have a go though. Laura, Phil, I can't wait to find out your favourites. But first, shall we talk numbers? Not in a competitive way. It's not about numbers.
Phil's going to win. It's okay. We can't compete with
I'm
Phil.
the worst person at tracking my reading as well. I just can't do it. So figuring out what I read this year for me has meant a frantic going through of our Instagram and listening back to old episodes and trying to figure out what on earth I read. But I did manage to compile a list. Maybe if I tell you mine first, because I feel like Phil's is going to be more than mine. I came up with 94, although I do keep remembering other ones.
So probably 100 or so.
Ish. How about you?
I have a preposterous number, which is 166.
100.
Listeners,
bravo.
if you don't know Phil, not only I'm sure is he reading every night into the wee hours, but he's also just wandering around New York listening to audiobooks. I think of Phil as having the dream life.
Listening to very sped up audiobooks too. So they're going fast and I'm walking a lot.
2 times or 1.5?
Cycle through life. Somewhere between the two, let's say.
It's all the more impressive because, as regular listeners will know, you like a long read. You're not hoovering up the quick fixes.
Yeah, I mean, there's some short books in there, but there's certainly some very long ones too.
And Laura, how did you get on with your reading this year?
Oh, well, I'm the straggler, but I think I read around 50. Like you, Kate, I'm not very good at recording them. I have a little note in my phone that every now and then I go back to and add to, but as I was going through my WhatsApp chat with our London book club, there were books bubbling up that weren't on the list. So I think it was about 50. I'm happy with that.
I've been conscious I have read less this year, and I know why that is. It's because this is the year I started a new job. So, of course, my reading time has gone down. What I do have now is the joy of a bit of a commute. So I get the lovely commute read, which is just, I think it's such a nice time to read on your commute. Just feels all like, oh, great, I'm off to work. I've got my book. I don't know. I just love it. I really
Absolutely.
like it. And I get to look around on the tube and I'm very heartened by the amount of people reading real books and enjoying them. It feels like this real little literary scene that's thriving down there. Okay, let's get to our books. We've got a lot to get through, and we are going to start with our favourite new release. So this is a book that was published in 2023. Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure. One of the challenges I face since moving to Vancouver, and I talk about this a lot, / complain about it a lot to Phil and Kate, is that we don't have any really amazing bookshops in Vancouver. We have small ones. I'm being a bit unfair. We have small ones. We don't have a Foyles or a big Waterstones like on Piccadilly, or even Powell's Books in Portland, or my favorite bookshop in the world, Elliott Bay, in Seattle. And so it can be really hard to find new releases, or just to have them on my radar at all. So I complain about this because it's hard for me to actually figure out what's being published without doing research. And then it's hard for me to find them. So I don't really feel like I've read a huge number of new releases this year, and certainly not ones that have surprised and delighted me. Now, my favorite one for the year then was not necessarily a surprise, but it was a delight, and that is August Blue by Deborah Levy, which came out in June. I've read a few of her previous books, one novel, one memoir, and I just love spending time with her as a writer. And her characters, there's always something slightly uncanny about the story she's telling. Have you guys read August Blue yet?
No.
I have a copy of it, which turned up in my little free library, which I immediately snaffled. So I've actually read the first chapter.
It's the story of a piano prodigy who, as a young child, is adopted by a man who heads up a school for musical prodigies. And so she's sort of his ward, she's sort of his student, she's sort of his daughter. And it's, in many ways, a positive relationship, but there's also a business aspect to it. And we meet her in her 30s during COVID, wandering around Europe. She's just ruined one of her performances. She didn't play what she was supposed to play in front of an audience of, say, 1,000 or so. I think it was in Austria. And now she's kind of gone to ground, and she's just teaching random students. And she also keeps seeing a doppelganger everywhere she is. And as I say, there's this uncanniness to it. There's this interesting premise. I feel like Deborah Levy, as a literary writer, isn't afraid of kind of starting with something really interesting and chewy. It's not a perfect novel, but I really, really enjoyed it and would highly recommend it.
Phil, how about you? Favorite new release?
My favorite new release just came out, I think both here and in the UK. It's called The Rainbow by Yasunari Kawabata. It is, in a way, a backlist, given that the original book was written 70 years ago in 1950, but it was just released, this new translation by Hayden Trowell. Kawabata was the first Japanese author to win a Nobel Prize for Literature. The book is set in post-war, sort of goes back and forth between Tokyo and Kyoto. In post-war Japan, the story, it's very, very quiet and subtle. It's these two half-sisters and their father, and there's a third half-sister who they've never met, half-sister to each of them. So the father had a child with 3 different women, and trying to reconnect with that third sister, but also processing some of the things that happened during the war. It is absolutely gorgeous. He puts them in these series of almost like hokusai paintings, gorgeous Japanese temples and gardens. And it feels like very quiet on the surface, but there's a lot of emotion bubbling up from underneath. And in a way, it really reminded me of, and I think it was an influence on Ishiguro generations later. I thought this was absolutely gorgeous and just really stuck out for me.
I have read Snow Country by him, which I read when I was in Japan and we were traveling around Hokkaido and it was actually snowy.
Yeah.
So I feel like I had the optimal reading setting for experiencing that book. And although I don't remember the ins and outs of it, I couldn't tell you the plot, but I do remember this very profound experience, the feelings and sensations that it evoked in me, and thinking, oh, yeah, I see why this writer won a Nobel Prize. It was amazing. That's kind of a strange one then. I feel like you've slightly flummoxed me with your new release because it's an old book.
One thing I would say, he said it's a new translation, and I was just looking it up because it sounds so good. It's the first translation. So
Right.
arguably it is a new release. It's never been accessible to English language readers before.
I feel like by the strict parameters of the category, it is, technically.
And yet I'm sort of cheating.
Fine. If you want to mess with all of our heads this early on in the show, that's absolutely fine. It's Christmas, we'll allow it. I'm impressed at both of you managing to so clearly and succinctly pull out one book there. I don't know if you had other books that you were happy not to mention. I don't feel that way, I'm afraid. I just have to throw in a few, but I promise I won't go on at length. Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks was a favourite discovery from the Women's Prize list. I had not expected to be as engaged and interested in a book about 1970s dubstep reggae culture as I was, but that was a real find. Ducks, graphic memoir by Kate Beaton that I read when I was visiting you, Laura, out in Canada, and I was looking for a copy and I couldn't find it anywhere. And I think it's because it's only available in hardback and it's such a big, heavy book. I'm pretty sure I left it there. I don't think I could face bringing it home. Yeah. But I really recommend that. That is an absolutely brilliant memoir of her time trying to pay off her student loans and working in the Alberta oil sands in this very male-dominated, misogynistic environment. And as you could easily imagine, she did not have a very good experience. But she documented it absolutely beautifully, and I have been really impressed at the way that story has stayed with me and how much I enjoyed it at the time. I remember almost not quite realising it crept up on me, but then at the end I was really, really, really sad to leave her world and her way of seeing the world. Oh, and then one more I just couldn't bear not to mention is Now Is Not the Time to Panic by Kevin Wilson, which is such a great story. It's sort of a little bit about art. It's about growing up in a certain period of time, kind of pre-internet age, where these two teenagers end up making this piece of art that they do via photocopying and then sort of pasting it around the town. And there was just something really delightful about that I loved. And it's a great story. It's not long. I really, really enjoyed it. But I think if I had to choose just one, I'm going to go for Kick the Latch by Kathryn Scanlan, which is a funny one because it is fiction. She describes it as fiction, but it's based on a series of interviews that she did with a real-life racehorse trainer. And it's about this woman's life and her experiences growing up in sort of poor part of America and making this career for herself, but always sort of scratching it out. And also being a woman in a man's world and how she managed to overcome the various challenges. It's a quiet story in lots of ways. You know, this is not a big, glamorous, exciting life. And yet it is so eventful and full of drama, and it's told so beautifully. And when you finish it, you sit back and you think, wow, how does she do that? There's such a magic here, but you can't really tell. And that's why, for me, it felt like such a special experience reading it. It's not like anything else I've read. I really, really loved it, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Kick the Latch by Kathryn Scanlan. I know what some of you are thinking. Hang on a minute. Weren't some of those books published in 2022? Keen-eared listeners, you are right. I only realised when I was doing the editing. I thought, shall I take them out? But they're such good books. I wanted you to know about them. So I've left them in. While I've got you, let me also quickly tell you about the Book Club Review's Patreon, where you can support the show and get some extras on the side. Membership includes my weekly Saturday Snippets newsletter themed around book recommendations, and you'll also get access to our just-launched library catalogue spreadsheet with book listings and notes. At the higher tier, you also have the opportunity to join our monthly podcast book club, with the recordings posted to catch up with if you can't make the live Zoom. We've got exciting plans for 2024 with a brilliant range of books I can't wait to get to. You'll find all the information at the link in the show notes, or go to patreon.com and search the Book Club Review. Okay, lots of books still to come. Enough with the sidebar. Let's get back to it. Okay, favourite backlist title. Phil?
I'm going to pull a Kate because it was very hard to decide on this one.
I want to hear about the also-rans, and I think our listeners do too.
Well, I'm going to give you a tie. One I think I was raving to you two about, which was I finally read. It's been sitting on my shelves for years and years. Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. It just blew my mind. I then went out and read more Sebald. For those who don't know, I think it came out in 2001. It starts very tangentially with this conversation with this man who's called Austerlitz in the Antwerp train station, and the unnamed narrator and him have long, 100-page discussion about architecture and the history of European imperialism. And ultimately then you find out the history of this man. He was, as a boy, a Kindertransport taken to Wales from his family in Central Europe, and dives into the ultimate origin of that. It's in a way very bleak, but in a way just so creative, so exciting. It just blew me away. It's a novel, but obviously grappling with a lot of history. The other backlist was just tied to my book, is The Woman Warrior by Maxine Kingston, which is a 1976 memoir from this Chinese-American woman. It's a memoir about her relationship with her mother, but also about her mother's life in pre-communist China. And she gets in via a lot of Chinese folktales, which are woven into the memoir. Her as a child imagining herself in these folktales. Again, thematically was doing so much and was really brilliantly written and really moving.
That sounds amazing. I haven't heard of that second one. That's new to me. For me, it came down to two, actually, similarly. It's the problem, isn't it, that often things we read at the very beginning of the year, you know, it could be the most extraordinary book you've ever read, but by the time you get all the way around to December, you're kind of like, oh, you know, there are things that maybe you read more recently that have stuck with you more powerfully. But going back through my list, I remembered a book that I absolutely love, which is called Charlotte, by a French author whose name I've never got round to checking how you pronounce, so I'm going to mangle it here as I always do whenever I talk about this book on the podcast. It's David Foenkinos. It tells the story of the artist Charlotte Salomon. I was not familiar with her work. I didn't know anything about her. So I think one of the reasons this book meant so much to me was just this discovery of this extraordinary art that she made. It really is incredible. But I didn't know that. Her story is a very tragic one because her family were Jewish, and so she didn't survive World War II. And you know that quite early on because of the way the story is told. And what he does is he takes you back into her life and her experiences, and you follow her through her story. It sounds like it would be a really sad, depressing read. I think the extraordinary thing about it is the degree to which it isn't that. It was somehow joyful and uplifting, and the pleasure comes from the way that he has preserved her story, brought her back into the light, you know, holding her up so that you can witness her life, experience her art. There was something so magical about that really was a delight, and I felt very happy to have read it. It meant a lot to me, that book, so I urge you to seek it out. And the other is A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, which is a real classic. I had never read it. It's not long. It tells the story of a ex-soldier who goes to this small village in Yorkshire where he is going to be in charge of restoring a mural that's been painted over on a church wall. And so you get the mechanics of him going there, and he's got his tools and he's setting about doing these things. And we learn that he's got a form of post-traumatic stress from his experiences in the war. And there is another man there who's doing some kind of archaeological excavations, who similarly is suffering from flashbacks and trauma and has his own story, which gradually is uncovered throughout the novel. But what it really is a book about memory and about time. And it's captured so beautifully in a way that it just really gives you something. It's like this sort of jewel of a book, and it gives you this sense of the idea that we live our lives and we have these experiences, but that time is always in motion. And so even if you could go back, if you could return to some point in your life where perhaps you had a particularly meaningful experience or you were particularly happy, it wouldn't be the same because everything has changed. You have changed. And this book really recognizes that. And there's something really so moving and meaningful about that. It's just so wonderful. It was such a beautiful book that I really treasured and recommended to people since. I was so glad I read it. People I mentioned it to, people know about it, I think. I feel like I was one of the last to discover it. People always say, oh, A Month in the Country, it's so great. It is really great. And so that has been my favourite backlist read of 2023. How about you, Laura?
So in the also-rans, I was very pleased with myself to get to Hilary Mantel's A Place of Greater Safety, which is her 1992 novel about the French Revolution, but really about the lives of the major players Georges Danton, Camille Desmoulins, and Maximilien Robespierre, because it starts with their childhoods and then leads up towards some very interesting events that took me by surprise.
I remember some confusion.
I did not know much about the French Revolution.
The actual stages of the French Revolution.
There was a moment where I turned around. I finished this book on an airplane back from a work event, and my boss was sitting behind me, and she's a huge reader anyway, and I turned around and was like, did you know this happened in the French Revolution? So very different reading experience if you don't know anything. I love Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy, and so what's interesting about this book is seeing the germination of that, because it is a really disorienting read. When people complain about Wolf Hall and the other books in that series, they're often like, I don't know who's talking. In A Place of Greater Safety, you do not know who's talking. It's very confusing, or who is who. But I still loved it, and it sort of washed over me. The other backlist title that was in the also ran category was Black Narcissus by Rumer Godden, which, Kate, you have read, published in 1939. And it's about nuns kind of going mad on the edges of the Himalayas. I should say Irish nuns, Scottish nuns, English nuns. And they've been sent to create a convent in this traditional building. And they all go a bit crazy. It is great. Phil, have you read that?
No, I really want to.
You need to, just as like a little sliver of delight, because it's so perfectly crafted. And I have a real soft spot for anything on mountains, it would appear, but particularly the Himalayas. And so I just love that. But I think the one that's going to take it all is The Ginger Tree by Oswald Wind, which was published in 1977 and recommended by my friend Caitlin, who's in my London book club with me and Phil. It was on her radar because Daunt Books sent it out as part of her monthly subscription. It's the story of a young Scottish woman who is married off, follows her husband from Edinburgh to the Chinese mainland, where he is working as a minor bureaucrat. And it all goes slightly pear-shaped when she has an affair with a Japanese diplomat in the area and she becomes pregnant. And so it then follows her life from there, and you move to Japan. And it's just this extraordinary portrait of pre-war Japan and her life thereafter. To your point, Kate, I read this actually in January last year. I had admittedly somewhat forgotten it, but when I saw it on my list, I was like, oh yeah, no, that was a great one and a real discovery.
Yeah, I have a copy of it waiting for me because I then got it thinking, oh yeah, this sounds so great. I haven't got around to reading it. I read a little bit because it's letters, isn't it? It's told in letters.
It is an epistolary novel, yeah, good point.
Okay, favourite non-fiction. Shall I get mine out of the way?
Sure, what was yours?
I made it sound like I was all ready to go, wasn't I? I'm looking through my options. Yeah, because I love a non-fiction read, but actually this year has been the year of memoirs and biographies. So I love Miriam Margolyes's memoir, This Much Is True, which I was surprised at how much I enjoyed that. That was a great read. And also, of course, you can listen to the audiobook and have her read it to you, which enhances the pleasure. I also I picked up a copy of a book of letters and book reviews and articles by Penelope Fitzgerald called A House of Air. I had read her novel, The Bookshop. I'd reread that and loved it so much more this time. I always loved it, but rereading it, I was really like, this is such a perfect book. I just want to read more. And so I went through a real Penelope Fitzgerald phase of dipping in and out of this wonderful compilation. It's a big, thick book. She wrote a lot. And I felt like just being instructed in the art of fine writing and also fine criticism. She referred to herself as a common reader. She didn't feel that she was some almost like sort of lofty academic type. And yet she was a very rigorous, thoughtful critic. And I felt I had a lot to learn from that. So that's been a real delight. But it came down to a couple. One I raved about on the pod at the time, and that is The Palace Papers by Tina Brown. Tina Brown popped up when the whole Harry and Meghan thing was kicking off, just as the only person I thought with anything sensible to say about the British royal family. She really caught my attention when I saw her on one of the morning shows. I thought, oh, yeah, that is an interesting point. And so when the book, The Palace Papers, came out, I picked up a copy, and it is such a great read. You would not think the British royal family could be this interesting, because actually the ins and outs of their daily lives are fairly boring, I think, when it comes down to the actual mechanics of what they do. But she just managed to weave together this brilliant analysis of the way the British class system works, the political function of the monarchy and the British royal family, the actual then human details of their lives and relationships, and this crazy goldfish bowl that they all had to live in, which actually is pretty inhuman, the way that they're expected to live so constantly in the public spotlight. And just some really interesting insight into the way that things may go now that Harry and Meghan have gone off to the States and leading separate lives. And so now all the pressure is on William and Kate and that marriage, and how's that going to last? It's such a great read. I really recommend it. But just quickly, I loved a book called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard, French academic. This obviously appealed to me as a person who spends a lot of time talking about books, but knows that there are far more books in the world than she will ever get to read. And I often feel quite frustrated about that. And so what I loved about Pierre Bayard's book is that he really lets you off the hook. He takes different figures from literature or other cultural icons. There's even a chapter that takes Bill Murray and Groundhog Day as its jumping off point. And he weaves this delightful series of arguments about why it's actually okay, and sometimes even preferable, he would argue, not to have read the books that you're trying to talk about. This is a whole book that makes a case for the fact that that's actually quite a helpful thing. And I loved it. I was delighted by it. I found it very refreshing. And I'd urge anyone who thinks that they might enjoy something along those lines to give it a try. It's a real delight. So How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard.
Phil, what about you? You read a lot of nonfiction.
I do read a lot of nonfiction. And I was actually trying to decide between several massive history tomes, and I'm not going to put those on my top one. I think the one that really has transformed how I think, and I've kept thinking about it since reading it in May, is a preposterously titled book called Karmageddon by Daniel Knowles, who is the Midwest correspondent for The Economist. He's a Brit who lives in Chicago. And this book is basically about the many ways that cars are destroying our world. This is a screed, it's an argument, but it's also incredibly backed up. He has lived all over the world, so he's not just focused on Chicago and the developed world, but also what cars are doing to the developing world, and not just their environmental impact, including the awful environmental impact of electric cars, but also talking about the safety implications. Where it really transforms is thinking about all of the ways our cities and our whole infrastructure is set up to enable cars. And as a sort of strident pedestrian who has an expired driver's license and basically avoids ever getting in a car, this is particularly on my long walks around New York City and elsewhere. It's really transformed how I think about everything. And I can't recommend this book enough.
Does he have a solution? Does he propose a way forward? Or is it really about analysing all the ways in which...
They're awful. No, he certainly has solutions. I mean, one of the most fascinating chapters is this chapter about Tokyo, which is basically an entire city set up, post-war Tokyo, not around cars, and has some of the lowest car ownership rates in the world and car usage rates in the world. Obviously, not all cities can become Tokyo tomorrow, but he has a lot of solutions on sort of how to shift policy over. It sounds dense and heavy. It is also a page. It's a really good read.
Well, he certainly nailed it with the title.
Yeah.
I could read that as someone who doesn't read a lot of nonfiction. I too hate cars. I have one now in Vancouver, but I moved downtown so that I could walk to work and have a car-free life. The only thing that gets in the way of that is the pouring winter rain at the moment. Then cars can be quite nice. As I say, I don't read a lot of nonfiction, so we're definitely in memoir land for me. For this category, my best nonfiction of the year would be Free by Leah Ippy. It's her memoir of life in Albania amid the collapse of communism. She was on the cusp of adolescence when communism fell in Albania. And so this memoir is about what she was told and what her understanding was about her family and her culture and the politics in her world through the lens of childhood. And then all that knowledge is undermined and transformed by the potential for her parents to actually tell her truth with the fall of communism and also her transitioning into adolescence. There's a real loss of innocence from what she understands to be the truth in the first half and her recounting of her family life and experiences. And then this loss of innocence halfway through. And it does get quite dark and depressing because you're with her, right? You've seen it through one lens and then the flip side of that, as well as the collapse of Albania economically post-communism, is really devastating. Fantastic memoir. I think we loved it as a book club book and we had a great discussion, the three of us.
It's so good, isn't it? And the way she makes ideas that might seem quite abstract political theory, through her eyes, you actually live it and you experience it and it doesn't seem abstract anymore. Suddenly you think, oh, right, I see why this is important. It's such a good book. I love that one too.
Same. Masterpiece, that book.
Well, that brings us on nicely to our favourite book club read of 2023. This is the year I said goodbye to running my own book club as we started our podcast book club, with their blessing, I might add. We had a lovely summer get-together and I pitched it to them that I basically was going to ditch them for a group of people that I would only know through the internet. And they were surprisingly fine about it. They were very nice. So now we have the podcast book club, which has very quickly become something that I really look forward to at the end of every month. It's so great. And I have this group of what I think of as invisible book friends that I get to meet up with once a month and talk books with. With my old book club this year, we read Free by Leah Ippy, 7.5 by Christos Tolkas, Australian author. It was a surprising book from an author that I have in the past really admired. It felt quite a challenging read. Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne by Kathryn Rundell. So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan. Monsters by Claire Diederer. And most recently, Time Shelter by Georgi Gospodinov, which won the Booker International Prize this year. Tough to choose from that lot, but for me it came down to Free by Leah Ippy and Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne by Kathryn Rundell, which was such a surprise because I suppose having studied the poetry of John Donne way back my A-levels in school, I had quite an idea of him as sort of this quite dry, boring, sort of long afternoons dozing off over the Flea in warm classrooms. And so I hadn't really expected to be that interested in this book, but it won the Baillie Gifford Prize, which is an excellent nonfiction prize, very reliable. You know, they know how to pick them. And so I suggested that we read it. And it is such a fantastic page turner. It is so gripping. And she manages to do this incredible thing of making this poetry that was written so long ago feel relevant and vital and inspiring and really electrifying. She manages to convey all that. And it's a lot to do with his writing. She's very, very good at drawing your attention to the bits that are those electric bits. Because it's not true of every single John Donne poem that every line is going to sear into your soul. You know, some of them you really have to sift out a lot of other stuff. But also, she conjured up this period, 17th century, almost in the way that Hilary Mantel is able to really bring the tastes and sounds and smells and really what it must have been like to live in that time vividly back to life. So Kathryn Rundell has the same ability, and it was a magical read. It was really inspiring. It made for a fantastic discussion. We all really enjoyed it. And the other very nice thing about it was that it led us on then to talking about poetry more generally, which is not something we've previously discussed. And then we had a wonderful discussion about poems that we have found meaningful. People were reading out poems that they remembered or brought along poems that they wanted to share. And that felt like a really special conversation that I was really glad to have had. So for lots of reasons, that has been my favourite book club read of 2023.
Phil and I are both in 2 book clubs. For the purposes of this episode, we're just going to talk about our shared book club, which I call our London book club because most of the people are still in London, but not all. We're spread out all over now. We were slightly embarrassed before we started recording to realize we haven't read a huge amount of books this year, which I think is kind of on me, kind of on the books we selected. The first on the list was Free by Leah Ippey, Victory City by Salman Rushdie, The Years by Annie Ernaux, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, and we're just now reading Arturo's Island by Elsa Moranti. Phil, what's your favorite from this list?
This was neck and neck for me between Free and The Years. I'm going to go with The Years because we already discussed Free. The Years, I think we raved about it on this podcast. It's just the perfect book club book. It's very short, succinct, but she packs so much in there about the history of France and her own experience. This is a memoir, basically, by Annie Ernaux, but it's written in the collective first person as this memoir of a generation. I thought it was so structurally ambitious, and not just ambitious, but successful at doing a completely new thing, at least new to me. I can't think of any book comparable. And it's resonated with me. I'm going to be giving it to people for Christmas. I could not praise that book enough.
That's my pick for the year too. One thing I would add is I still think about the very first chapter, which doesn't feel like a memoir. It almost feels like a standalone essay about the nature of time and memory and how it's handed down through generations. It transformed how I think about human history and human memory and generational memory before then turning into this extraordinary collective memoir. She's a Nobel Prize winner, and I'm always slightly daunted by Nobel Prize winners. And then certainly in this case, you read her and you're like, well, yeah, obviously she's a Nobel Prize winner. And why do I not only read Nobel Prize winners?
Yeah, it was interesting talking about Time Shelter with the podcast book club, which is also a book about memory. It's exploring the idea of creating environments that recall specific eras in time and what people experience when they go into those environments. And actually, it was really helpful that I had read The Years by Annie Ernaux, because it was interesting, the two are investigating some of the same ideas, but in very different ways. And I loved the way, for me, having read both, that they complemented each other. And one very nice thing about that discussion was that what we ended up with was this really nice list of follow-on or complementary readings. This idea of memory and time is obviously something that interests a lot of writers. And actually, it can make for a really nice theme for a reading stack, I think. So yeah, I added in A Month in the Country, and it's great. Favorite comfort read? Hasn't been the easiest of years. I think the point at which I got to my 6th incredibly downbeat Booker book, and I just wanted to curl into a ball and hide under the bed. I was really struggling. It was not easy. And also, obviously, difficult things happening in the world that are distressing to hear about and think about. We can't ignore them. It's really important that we don't, but it's about finding that balance, isn't it? And being able to pay attention and face up to things without, at the same time, just going to pieces ourselves. And so for that, you've got to line up your comfort reads. So this is the year that comfort reading has really meant a lot to me. And I was very happy to see that Nina Stibbe, who wrote a book that's one of my classic comfort read books. It's called Love, Nina. And it's another epistolary book, a series of letters that she wrote home from when she was nannying in London. And the person she was working for was Mary Kay Wilmers, who is the editor of the London Review of Books. So what you get in Love, Nina is this brilliantly observed, very comic recounting of the ins and outs of the everyday domestic arrangements in this family, but also all of these brilliant, funny, behind-the-scenes asides about all these very high-level literary folk that she's interacting with. Again, when you see the very ordinary domestic side of their lives, that was a real gem. I love her voice. She's since written many successful novels, but this is another diary of hers, very recent. It tells the story of, probably it was last year, maybe 22, that she spent living in London, and she rents a room in the house of the author Deborah Morgatch, who wrote the Marigold Hotel. I can't remember the name of the film. It was a book.
Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, right?
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Yes. And also Tulip Fever, I think, was another very successful book of hers. Anyways, well-known, well-connected novelist. And so again, you get this thing about everyday life living in London. She's writing and she's observing life around her, sprinkled with all these little delicious asides about literary folk that she's interacting with. And also because she's now a well-known person on the literary circuit herself. So she's going to book festivals and she's doing readings and she's doing a pub quiz with Nick Hornby and hanging out with Kathy Renzer-Briggs. And it's just a lot of fun. I really enjoyed spending this time in her company and I loved that. Went to London, took the dog. I also really enjoyed a book called The Grove, a nature odyssey in 19½ front gardens by Ben Dark. I didn't really know anything about him, but he turns out to be quite a well-known gardener, and he wrote this lovely book about all the front gardens that he passed when he was walking around with his baby in the pram. You know, small babies. You discover quite early on that if you take them out and push them around, there's something about being out and the fresh air, and they do usually conk out. So this is a well-known tactic. And he was noticing all these gardens that he passed and all these really everyday things like privet hedges or cherry trees or magnolias or garden roses, buddleia, all very, very, very familiar London plants. And each chapter gives you a little bit of a history and explores almost like the backstory. And I loved that. And what I particularly loved is it really made me look at London with new eyes. Now when I'm wandering around, I see these things, I think, oh yeah, that was that thing. It was written really beautifully as well. I really enjoyed that. But my top comfort read was a new discovery, but I just know this is going to be a book that I will go back to again and again. It's set in a bookshop. It's called Once Upon a Tome by Oliver Darkshire. And it tells of his time working in the antiquarian bookshop Southerns, which has been going for a long time, sort of 200 years or something, I think, and is in this little side street in Piccadilly, near where I work. And he just tells the story of what it's like working in this shop. But the thing is, I've never actually been there, so I can't verify this, but the way he describes it, it's such an otherworldly place. And there's something so enjoyable about that. It's almost like it's got kind of like a fantasy element, you know, where you expect there to be goblins or some kind of pit, or you open a door and you're going to go through to a parallel dimension. It's written in this very whimsical way, and yet what's brilliant is that all of this stuff, as far as I can tell, is absolutely true. The people that he works with are incredibly strange and eccentric. The customers are even more bizarre and eccentric. And the books that they want are fascinating. And it's all very funny. It's very quirky. It's very delightful. I hadn't read anything like it before. I really, really, really enjoyed it. And at the end, just as you couldn't think it would get any better, there's a choose your own adventure style game where you can practice running your own bookshop, where you have rent on your shop is due in 10 days, so you've got to sell some books, and then you've got scores for money, time, and patience, and you roll your dice, and you can play out your day at the shop and see how it goes. And once you've read the book, you've had the training, so I would expect you to do very well. I love it so much. It's such a wonderful read. Once Upon a Tome, it's called.
I was slightly embarrassed by how much comfort reading I did when I was totaling up all my books. I was like, check. I mean, comfort reading, yes, it's a good category, and I'll come to that. But I mean, even like, what is comfort reading? Why do we read? Is comfort reading something to be embarrassed about, or, I don't know.
Oh, I don't think so.
No, I know.
Yeah,
but even like putting it in a category, I would say some people only comfort read. But anyway, I mean, one of the reasons I'm in book club is to keep me from quote unquote only comfort reading. Now, that said, I finally this year discovered Eva Ibbotson, who has been recommended to us on the podcast in the past by Elizabeth of Crib Notes newsletter as her comfort go-to author. And I read 3 Eva Ibbotsons in a week. I read the first one, it was like, great. Read the second one, great. I came to Medensky Square. It is a comfort read, but it's also not as escapist as her other novels. I would highly recommend it to anyone as a historical novel, while also just being this delightfully moving, sweet package all wrapped up. It's about a dressmaker in Vienna pre-World War I, I think. Oh gosh, one of the world wars. She has a very successful, thriving dressmaking business overlooking Medensky Square, and so the novel's about the inhabitants of that square. It's also about her relationship with a high-ranking military officer who dips in and out of her life. He has his own married life, very separate to hers, and their relationship's very secret. And it's about change that is coming because there's plans to remake Vienna and to put through new thoroughfares, and that will destroy Medensky Square. I really love this book. I will read it again. Medensky Square takes the lot, but I would just say that embarrassingly, I have read Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld twice since it came out in March. I think what I like about that book the most, though, is that the 2 protagonists, one is a female staff writer on the equivalent of Saturday Night Live, and the other, her love interest, is a very famous musician, and they meet on set of Saturday Night Live, which is called something different. But that first third is just so great as an introduction to how those shows are produced in 1 week, and the process of creating sketches and getting them up on stage and having the actors and or famous people dip in. That was pretty fun too.
I got a copy of that in the school Christmas fair. I was doing the bookstall. And the brilliant thing about doing the bookstall is that you get first pick of all the books. And I snaffled that one so fast. I'm saving it for that post-Christmas lull. I'm really looking forward to it. Phil, how about you? Are you a comfort reader?
Actually, I struggled with this, so I don't think I am. Certainly not to the extent Laura is. The thing that I think would win this category, although again, it's stretching what is a comfort read, as I sort of wanted something I was guaranteed to know I would love, I've been working through Maggie O'Farrell's Backlist, and Notes from a Heatwave, her 2011 novel, was just absolutely great. It was this novel about this Irish-British family falling apart in the mid-70s, the 3 adult children and their parents and their secrets in the family attic. She goes around through the family, all the different perspectives. There's this amazing perspective. The youngest daughter, Aoife, is dyslexic, but has basically never been diagnosed and therefore has never learned to read. And she feels deep shame about this. And her chapters are just astonishing. It's a family drama. It's just so well written. Maggie O'Farrell, I'm sure I've praised her before, but I really vibe with her descriptions, and her characters always seem immediately fleshed out. That one in particular jumped out at me. For a more typical genre comfort read, I was going to go with this book, Going Zero by Anthony McCartan. And this is a pure thriller. I think he is a screenwriter. The premise of this book is that there's this evil tech billionaire who has this company, Beta, which is trying to show off their new all-seeing technology called Fusion, which can track people anywhere. And so they select 10 people to go off the grid and try to not be detected by the evil tech company. There's various machinations, and the ending isn't quite as good as the setup, but that was a very fun, gripping page-turner that I had a lot of fun with.
I'm in. That sounds great.
All right, well, I almost didn't put this category in, but I thought, oh, well, maybe it's interesting. This is just, let's not dwell on it, but the books that didn't quite meet our expectations. I read The Thursday Murder Club. I'm on record as being very dubious about that book, although I continue to go back to, is it unfair of me to be negative about a book that so many people have really loved and enjoyed? And I suppose on those terms, it's obviously touching something in people. What was more interesting to me was when you take away the marketing hype and the fact that he himself is a very charismatic, likable person who has a big profile before he started writing novels. When you come down to the actual mechanics of the book and what it was and what it did, did it really succeed? That was the element of my disappointment, really, was that I just felt like on that level, it didn't really deliver what I would have wanted a crime, even a cozy crime, to do, which was a bit of a twisty-turny plot and not being able to figure out who did it. It felt to me like a lot of that stuff was telegraphed really early on. And also the cozy angle of it. I did love the whole thing about the sprightly 4 OAPs who are the crime busters. And that's a brilliant idea. And there's nothing not to love about that. And they are good. They're interesting characters. It was just all the side characters. That depiction of old age was often incredibly downbeat. These are people who are really lonely, often grieving, often ill and depressed and suicidal. And I found that as an insight into old age and almost like what many of us have got to look forward to. Really soul-crushingly depressing. I found that really hard to read. And so I think that's also why there's a sort of slight level of bafflement to me at what it is that people love about these books. But it's a juggernaut, isn't it? Phil, I believe you saw him speak in a New York bookstore.
I did not go. I was just in the bookstore and saw that he was...
Yeah, but he was doing a talk with Harlan Cobden, wasn't he? And it's just interesting that in the UK, that probably would have been completely mobbed. Whereas I think in America, what was it? Sort of Barnes & Noble or something. You know, he was just quietly doing his thing and no one was paying much attention.
It had a crowd, but it was not a packed audience. Yeah.
Funny. How about you guys? Any disappointments this year?
I'm going to have fun here and try and keep Phil and I from going off track. And don't take this personally, Phil. But Phil recommended to me Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton. And he's like, I raced through it. It was really enjoyable. And I was like, fantastic. I picked up a copy. I took it on holiday with me. To be fair, I read it in about 72 hours. What a ludicrous book. Like, good Lord. The characters. So it's set in New Zealand. And there's this group of young 20-something guerrilla gardeners / guerrilla farmers, and they're looking around Auckland for places where they can plant vegetables and so forth. They're kind of off-grid. They're not really doing any damage. There's a bunch of politics within this group of activists, and the central relationship is between these 2 young women. And one wants to leave the group, but she hasn't quite said it yet. The other one knows. The main leader, the one who knows and wants to keep her friend in the mix, finds out about this property that's been left untended up in the mountains because of a landslide that's come down and isolated this town. She goes out there to suss it out and then moves the group out there to guerrilla farm this land. At the same time, there's this evil Elon Musk character who is doing something very dubious on that land to do with extraction. It just gets crazy, Phil. And to be clear, if it was a regular thriller, I would expect it to be somewhat ridiculous. But this is by Eleanor Catton, who's won the Booker in the past. I almost threw the book across the room at the very end. So it did not live up to expectations.
Interesting, because many people have really enjoyed it. And it's certainly, I think it was on the New York Times, maybe not the top 10.
I think it was, yeah.
It wasn't on the top 10, I don't think. It was
Mostly, but I think it was on the notable book,
Yeah. I mean, in its defense, if you give it the expectations like Going Zero, sort of similar plot with the evil tech billionaires. Obviously, the Eleanor Catton has more literary pretensions, but on its basic level of being a thriller and being a page turner, I think you have to agree. You turned those pages.
I think I do. And that's why this category is that books that didn't quite live up to our expectations. If my expectations had been different, I might not have read it, first of all. And 2, I wouldn't be so critical now.
Fair.
It sounds like it might be good for book club.
I mean, I would enjoy ranting about it. The GCSE, young people talking about the state of the world. I think, Phil, you said you liked that, whereas I was just like, I roll.
Oh, yeah, I lived like that. It was fun. Mine, last year I had a very long rant about the Hanya Yanagihara book, A Little Life. This year, it was just sort of a mild disappointment that made me sad, which was this book, Woman of Light, by Kali Farhado Anstein. It was her first novel. I had loved her book of short stories called Sabrina and Karina from 2019, which was this very sharply delivered, gorgeous stories set around Denver, Colorado, with these various Mexican-American and indigenous communities telling these stories and showing this world that at least I did not know much about. I highly recommend that book. This first novel of hers, Woman of Light, is a historical novel set in Denver in the 1930s. And there was some interesting plot. There was some interesting setting and history, but the characters all felt flat and slightly cliched, and it just made me very sad. I had been very much looking forward to this first novel, and it just didn't quite stick the landing. But I'm just going to turn this into a recommendation for Sabrina and Karina, her 2019 book of short stories, which is gorgeous for anyone who's not read it.
Yeah, that's a new author to me. I haven't heard of her at all. All right, well, just before we get to the final overall book of the year, the book of 2023, I wanted to feed in a few recommendations from the Patreon book club who've been letting me know some of their favourites. The only trouble with the Patreon is that often I don't know people's real names. I just know them by their usernames. And so it might sound slightly odd sometimes. The first one was just Q, the Patreon member known as Q. They let me know that some of their favourite reads were a book called Loot by Tanya James, historical fiction based on a real toy tiger from Mysore that's currently housed at the V&A Museum here in London. The novel follows a fictional Indian apprentice and explores the term loot historically to the present day. I looked it up. Lauren Groff calls it a wild, dazzling 18th century romp across continents with profound things to say about invention and self-reinvention, class and fate, and the deeply human hunger to create family. Anything endorsed by her, I'm always interested in. Q also mentioned Factory Girls by Michelle Gallen, Irish novel about a young 18, 19-year-old woman coming into her own during the Troubles, characterised by very dark humour and a matter-of-fact quality about the great political issues. Also, Cider House Rules, a classic by John Irving. It was very enjoyable, and the subject feels timeless and relevant today. And Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung, which I had heard of. This is a collection of short stories that are infused with a bit of magical realism and folklore. Influences from Korean and Russian cultures, the stories have a wide range of memorable characters. Good to know about that. That is one that I have heard of. It's sort of slightly on my radar, so I was interested to hear her views on it. Nicola Poplaski says, I feel compelled to add another category, Down Under Brilliance. So this is reads from New Zealand and Australia, and I know we do have many listeners there. So hello to all of you. Standouts, she says, from my 2023 reading list were The Axeman's Carnival by Kathryn Chidgey, which apparently is narrated by a magpie. Not Now, Not Ever, 10 years on from the misogyny speech edited by Julia Gillard. I looked up that speech, which she gave in the House of Parliament in Australia, and it is absolutely electrifying. If, like me, you didn't know about it, I suggest you give it a watch. It's absolutely incredible. So I imagine that's a really interesting read. And All That's Left Unsaid by Tracy Lien. In a Vietnamese immigrant community in Sydney, Australia, a woman investigates her teenage brother's murder, which sounded to me like it would be a powerful page-turner. And she flags up as a favourite read, Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton. So maybe we will do it for the podcast book club. And Laura, you can come along and you two can duke it out. I am very intrigued to read it myself and see what I think. Caroline V let me know, I loved Fire Rush. Reading the Women's Prize shortlist was a wonderful way to find books I wouldn't have chosen. Free is definitely on my top 2023 reads. Picking two favourites is hard. I know, it's so hard, isn't it? So she says, I'm going to go with the ones that stayed with me. And they were River Sing Me Home by Eleanor Shearer. She says it's an exploration of what it means to be free. This novel is set following emancipation in Barbados as a formerly enslaved woman takes on a difficult journey to find her children. She says she found it heartbreaking and hopeful. And Charlotte Kisley, finally, messaged to say her favourite comfort read was The Boy and the Dog by Seishu Hase, a wonderful tale about the journey of a dog through contemporary Japan. He's taken care of by various different people, including a thief and a prostitute, and we hear their stories. It sounds like it would be cheesy, but it's not. It's brilliant and heartwarming. Her favourite backlist title was Cakes and Ale by Somerset Maugham, which made me laugh, Laura, because I just remembered one book we did at the podcast one time that you really struggled with of his. She says, this addictive story of writers is barely dated at all. Favourite from the podcast, The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Roffey. I have been listening to back episodes of the pod, she says, to get book recommendations, and this one just swept me away. Beautiful and strong writing with a profound message. Her favourite book club read was with her local village book group, and it was called Machines Like Me by Ian McEwan. It's about a highly sophisticated robot and how it interacts with its human owners. Really compulsive read and very thought-provoking ideas. It made for a brilliant discussion. And her favourite non-fiction was Free by Leah E.P. Overall favourites, she says, this is tricky, but overall I love Death of the Penguin by Andrei Kirchhoff and The 16 Trees of the Somme by Lars Mitting. The first because it was offbeat and surprising, the second because the plot was so compelling and intricate. So, thank you to all the lovely patroneers for messaging me. It's come to it. It's the final moment. Our overall book of the year. Who wants to go first? Phil, do you want to take the lead?
I feel impossibly pretentious because this is going to be my third Nobel laureate book, but I finally got around to reading after being surprised but not knowing who he was when he was awarded Jon Fosse's Septology, which came out a couple years ago. He wrote it after giving up alcohol 10 years ago and converting to Catholicism. My friend Sam came on the Fitzcarraldo podcast, and this was his recommendation. I've never read a book like this. On the surface level, it's just this old man giving a stream of consciousness description of the book, which was published as 7 books in 3 volumes, but which I have in just 1 volume, basically spans a week. And this man talks about very banal things, going and getting groceries and meeting a friend. And at the same time, while he's having this very banal surface level thought and very repetitive thought, it captures both the pace, but also the repetitive, almost boring nature of our stream of consciousness. But at the same time, it becomes meditative. Ultimately, then you also get his whole life, and you have these various doppelgangers that Fosse is playing with. There's another version of this man who he is friends with. It's unclear if this is a real person or not, who has this parallel life but has not given up alcohol, and who starts the novel. He finds him passed out on the street and he brings him to a hospital, the ultimate version. And even his wife, the protagonist's name is Asle and his wife's name is Asel, just like 2 letters switched, A-S-E-L versus A-S-L-E. And everything is just little twists of his own consciousness almost. There's other doppelgangers throughout, and it was just one of the most astonishing, exciting books I've read in years, I would say, and so moving. It ultimately is about grief and mortality and God. A lot of these books within the larger book end with prayers. I've never read anything like this, and it blew me away.
I wanted to read something by him, and when he won the Nobel, the person who was presenting the prize did a little piece to camera where he recommended, he said, if you're thinking about trying Jon Fosse, you should try this early work by him. It's called Morning and Evening, and it's not long. And I read it, and I have to say, it's one of the most extraordinary books I've ever read in my life. It only didn't make my final top books because it's so slight. It's barely even 100 pages, less than that. But it was just the most extraordinary story about that almost like slightly liminal space between life and death and memory and experience, and all packed into this tiny book. And I was just like, oh my goodness. Okay, fine, yes, now I see why this man won the Nobel Prize. He should absolutely have won that.
Laura, what was yours?
My book of the year, and perhaps somewhat influenced by proximity, is Stay True by Hua Su, which I read on holiday a few weeks back now. It was on my radar. I think, Phil, you had already messaged us about it over WhatsApp. And then I was on the big island of Hawaii and snuck out with my husband, and we drove up into what I'm going to call the Highlands, this town, Waimea. And it had the best coffee shop, surf shop, with a selection of books. And Kate, they were all the kind of books you would love. Perfectly curated nonfiction and memoirs. I mean, this is the kind of thing where Kate's going to turn to her husband and be like, we got to go to the big island because I heard about the shop.
I have been to Hawaii, but of course this is pre-children days. I don't think there's any chance of us ever going back.
And there it was waiting for me. Stay True by Hua Su, which won a Pulitzer Prize this year, which Phil had mentioned. And so I picked it up and took it back and read it for the duration of my holiday. It is a memoir by Hua Su, who is now a New Yorker staff writer, and he went to college at Berkeley in the mid-90s. He's the son of Taiwanese immigrants. They came over in the 1970s, and he does weave in their story. But the focus was really his time at Berkeley and the friendship that emerged between him and another young Asian American man named Ken Ishida. Now, in many ways, these 2 young men had nothing in common other than society putting them together as Asian Americans. Hua's family, as I said, were Taiwanese. Ken's family were Japanese and had been in America for decades before. I think he was either 3rd or even 4th generation. Hua is also, and I love this portrait of himself so much. He's just incredibly pretentious between the ages of 18 and 21, and everything's sort of staged and thought through, and he's obsessed with music, and in some ways he's very annoying. And this is the narrator describing himself as a young man. And then there's Ken, who's this charismatic, charming, thoughtful frat boy. And when Hua first encounters him, he doesn't like him at all. But this friendship emerges, which I think is really driven by Ken's compassion and empathy for people. And Hua feels seen by this young man in a way that he could never have expected. And then we know from the very beginning, from the back, that Ken is murdered in a really brutal carjacking. It's described as a carjacking, but it's actually more complex and disturbing than that. And so this is a memoir about friendship, the Asian American experience, and how unique that is to different individuals. And then it's about love. And it's this portrait of this incredible young man. There's this little scene at the very end, and it's so small, where Hua sees Ken in Nordstrom's. I think he's selling shoes, and just this moment of human connection that he witnessed. That is a real tribute to Ken's character. I should also say that because I'm younger than Hua-Su and Ken by probably 10 years, and nonetheless, it's a portrait of the 1990s and music, and there's so much detail. And zines, Kate, you mentioned a zine earlier. You know, they're like creating their own campus culture. There's no internet really as yet. I think there was email, and he talks a little bit about what that means at the time. A fantastic book, and I think one that has a lot of attention already, but everyone would really love to read, and potentially not to be too cliche, but be changed by.
That book also made me sob. It is very heartbreaking on top of everything, but gorgeous.
Yeah, I've got a little stack of books that I want to read that I didn't manage to get to this year that I'm queuing up for the beginning of next year, and that is absolutely on it. I am really, really, really looking forward to reading that one. My overall book of the year. Oh my goodness, it's so hard. I just wanted to flag up a few that were amazing. How to Read Now by Elaine Castillo is a really, really, really interesting essay collection that's looking at the idea of reading, as in reading books, sure, but it's also looking at how to read now, as in the contemporary culture and the world that surrounds us. I found it really dazzling, and actually her mind works on such a level that I had to really work quite hard to keep up. I liked that. I really wanted to meet the challenge, and it really significantly changed my thinking and a lot of my assumptions about things, particularly the idea. She's got a very good chapter on the expected reader. Her own background is her family are from the Philippines, but she grew up in America. She realized quite early on that she was not the expected reader for a lot of the things that she was reading, and it's really interesting on assumptions about race and culture and identity. So that I wanted to just flag up as a very, very, very worthwhile book to seek out. Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy is the most astonishing and beautifully written novel about the early days of motherhood. I feel like there's a lot of books about this, and often tackling it in a really interesting way. And so I think one of the things I really loved about Soldier Sailor was the way that it felt like she had a really fresh, really interesting take on it. It's a wonderful read. I really, really enjoyed it. I would recommend it to everyone, whether you have had children or whether you don't have children in your life. That doesn't matter. This is a really, really wonderful book about human experience with a pleasing edge to it that I really enjoyed. I have to mention The Vast Worlds, the new book by Lauren Groff, which is extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's a kind of breathless rush of a read that follows a young girl's flight from an early colonial settlement in America. She is on the run, and as the story unfolds, you learn why. It's about survival. It's about the wilderness that she is moving through, but it's, of course, about a lot more. It's about the nature of being human and existence. And Lauren Groff, I thought this is absolutely extraordinary. It's an incredibly depressing read. It's really quite hard to deal with and process, which is maybe why it's not my top fave. But I absolutely think it's worth seeking out. And I have been surprised that it has not had more attention, because the quality of the writing is just exceptional. But my top book, my favorite book of 2023, I thought, this is the book I have had the most conversations with people about. This is the book that I have recommended the most. This is the book that I have read twice. I've talked about it with the podcast book club. It's just felt like it's been a very rich, rewarding read for me. And that is Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma by Claire Deborah, which is her exploration of what we do with our feelings about art made by, and they are invariably, men with complicated, problematic, real-life biographies. So Roman Polanski is her starting point. Woody Allen, she talks about. She looks at figures from literature like Hemingway. She looks at Picasso. There's a really interesting, slightly, doesn't seem to quite fit chapter on Nabokov, but I thought she explores him and his writing and Lolita in a really interesting way. It looks at some people from contemporary culture, Michael Jackson, different figures, but all very familiar, and will spark lots of ideas and questions. And I love that it's very open-ended. She's not trying to answer this problem. She's more exploring some different solutions and some different ways of thinking about it, and inviting you to consider the matter and go off and talk about it, come to your own conclusion. And I just loved that. I thought it was so refreshing and fun. And yeah, it's nonfiction, but it's a great page turner. It's written really beautifully, and I really, really, really enjoyed it. It was sparky and provoking and encapsulated a lot of what I love about book club, which is my love of open-ended discussion and debate. It's all there.
I feel like we've given listeners 3 very different best books of the year.
Yeah.
For them to do what they will with.
It's a broad church. And how about looking ahead to 2024? Have you got any plans, or what's the book that you're dying to get to that you didn't manage to finish in 23? Or reading resolutions?
I'm quite excited by Arturo's Island by Elsa Moranti, which is my next book club book. That was Phil's recommendation. I've only just started, and I can't quite put my finger on the tone and where it's going to take me. There's something almost Dickensian in its description. Dickens on a small island off the coast of Naples. I don't know. Seems great.
How about you, Phil?
I have another book group. We've now worked through 2 of Search for Lost Time, the Proust 6-volume set. So hopefully this coming year I will be finishing that, and we'll see if I'm a wiser person after it. I'm not sure. I've enjoyed the first 2 volumes.
I feel a pod special coming on when you've got to the end of that. I've got the little stack here of things that I didn't manage to get to this year that I can't wait to try and read next year. August Blue, Deborah Levy. Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce, which has been recommended to me by a couple of people as a comfort read. Fight Night, Miriam Toews. Cahokia Jazz by my beloved Francis Bufford. I didn't have time to read. That's
latest. On my list too.
Yeah, and apparently it's good. I hear good things. Teju Cole, I don't quite know how to pronounce his name. Tremor. I read a review of this in the Times and it sounded fantastic. So I ordered that without knowing too much about it. And The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut. His previous book was one of my absolute favourite things I read last year. So I was really excited that he's got a new one out, and then I haven't had a chance to read it. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into that. And I'm going to keep a better record next year. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I am going to try and do it. So that when we come to the end of 2024, I won't be scrambling around trying to figure out what on earth I read. It's going to be a new me. Well, I'm looking forward to lots more reading and lots more conversations about books, which are such a joy. And yeah, really, I think my very favourite things that I get to do in this life is to talk books with you guys. So thank you.
Likewise.
And Happy New Year.
Thanks so much. Happy New Year, Carl.
Thanks, listeners, for listening in 2023, and hope you'll be around in 2024.
Don't say that. That sounds like there's going to be some terrible apocalypse.
Stick around.
The sentiment is good, though, yeah. Thank you, listeners. That's nearly it for this episode. You'll find all the books listed in the show notes, plus a transcript at the episode page on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk. You'll also find our archive of over 150 episodes, all of them good, and so have a browse. Find out how to support us via our Patreon account at patreon.com/thebookclubreview, where you'll also find the extras you get in return. One free way to support us, of course, is to rate and review the show via your podcast app, which helps other listeners to find us. Laura and I really appreciate it. Between shows, you can catch up with what we're reading on Instagram and Threads at Book Club Review Podcast. We wish you a wonderful year of books to come in 2024. Thanks so much for listening, and happy book clubbing.